The desert stretched endlessly beneath a sky that seemed to swallow everything whole. The land was unforgiving, the terrain a vast sea of golden dunes that rolled like the ocean's waves, but with a deadly edge. The sun, a relentless and blinding force, beat down on the earth, shimmering off the heat-soaked sand, creating mirages that distorted the horizon. There was no shelter, no escape, only the sharp, biting wind, carrying the weight of 1,000 grains of sand, cutting into the skin like tiny needles. And then there was silence, a deep, suffocating silence that hung thick in the air, broken only by the distant rumble of engines and the occasional staccato of gunfire. But even that felt far away, swallowed up by the vastness of the desert. The ground beneath was dry and cracked, parched by the unrelenting sun, and yet it seemed to hum with a quiet, invisible menace. The German tanks, tigers of steel, pride of the Third Reich, moved slowly across this desolate expanse, their tracks kicking up clouds of dust that swirled like ghosts in the harsh, unblinking sunlight. These machines were built for war, for battlefields of mud and steel, for endless fields of fire. But here, in the unforgiving desert, they began to falter. The heat gnawed at their engines. Their heavy armor became a curse, and the very sand beneath their wheels seemed to conspire against them. The tanks, once symbols of unstoppable force, sank deeper into the earth with each passing hour, their engines sputtering, their wheels spinning uselessly in the thick, shifting sand. Inside the M10 Wolverine Tank Destroyer, Private First Class Ray Thompson watched through a fogged periscope, his breath shallow and ragged. He was alone in his thoughts, his mind sharp and focused despite the freezing cold creeping through the cracks in the tank. The wind outside was merciless, the sand hammering against the metal hull with a fury that seemed as relentless as the war itself. But it was the silence that gnawed at him the most. The desert wasn't just a landscape, it was a presence. It didn't need to shout. It didn't need to roar like the thunder of artillery. It had a power all its own. A quiet, slow power that chipped away at the very spirit of the soldiers and machines that dared to traverse it. Just 800 yards away, the German tanks crawled forward, unaware of the eyes that watched them from the cold steel of the Wolverine. The sun, now low on the horizon, painted the sky in shades of crimson and orange, casting long shadows over the tanks and the men who operated them. Ray Thompson's gloved hands trembled not from fear, but from the bitter cold, the kind that sunk deep into the bones, that made every movement feel like an effort. And yet, despite the desert's oppressive heat and cruel cold, the sand beneath their wheels was the true enemy, an enemy that would grind down even the mightiest of tanks. The German column, once confident and powerful, was now vulnerable. It was just a matter of time before the desert's unforgiving grasp would claim its first victim. As the tanks moved forward, the only sound Ray heard was the whisper of the wind, carrying with it the weight of 1,000 forgotten battles. And in that silence, one thing was clear. In this campaign, the desert itself would be the judge, and no amount of firepower could change that. The German tanks, colossal and imposing, rumbled across the barren desert landscape like titans marching into an unknown battle. At the front of the column, the Tiger I tank led with its immense, hulking frame. Its long barrel, capable of cutting through steel at distances beyond the reach of most Allied guns, seemed almost to pierce the sky itself. Behind it followed the Panzer IVs, smaller but no less deadly, their smooth, efficient lines cutting through the air with mechanical precision. These were machines built for one thing: war. They had dominated Europe's battlefields, unstoppable in their advance. Their steel exteriors were a symbol of German might, their engines a promise of relentless force. But here, in the unforgiving desert, they were mere iron behemoths, ill-prepared for the challenges of the terrain. As they moved deeper into the vast expanse of sand, the first signs of trouble began to show. The heat from the desert sun beat down with such intensity that even the mighty engines of the German tanks began to groan under the strain. The massive machines, designed for European fields and forests, were unfit for this brutal, open terrain. The sand, fine and ever-shifting, clogged their treads, grinding them to a halt with every few hundred meters. The engines, already working overtime to push through the oppressive heat, started to overheat. The tanks, once symbols of impenetrable power, began to show cracks. Fuel lines, stretched and strained in the heat, started to leak, creating pools of gasoline beneath their hulls. Mechanical failures became more frequent, yet the column pressed on, its path still set toward the vital crossroads. The German soldiers inside the tanks were just as trapped by the desert as their machines. The crews, accustomed to the cold and rain of Eastern Europe, were now sweating inside their heavy uniforms, their faces streaked with grime and dust. The relentless heat, combined with the confined space of the tank, created a stifling atmosphere inside the steel behemoths. The men could hear the constant, shrill whine of the engines, each rev a reminder of their own vulnerability. The tanks, though formidable, seemed like giants stumbling through a wilderness they had never prepared for. The desert wasn't a battlefield, it was a slow, unforgiving predator, and it didn't care how advanced or powerful the machines were. It didn't matter that the Germans had designed these tanks to dominate. In the shifting sands, the tanks were not invincible. They were machines designed for a different kind of war, a war fought on more predictable, solid ground. Here, in the desert, that predictability was gone. With every passing minute, the sand seemed to chew at the wheels of the German tanks, turning their once unstoppable momentum into a slow, grinding crawl. The German officers, with their maps and orders, could only watch in frustration as their tanks slowed, overheated, and began to falter. No matter how hard they pushed forward, the desert had the upper hand. The heat, the sand, the isolation, they were no longer fighting just the Allies. They were fighting the land itself. And it was clear that the desert had no mercy. While the German tanks lumbered through the unforgiving desert, the Allied forces remained hidden, just out of sight but ever watchful. The men, well acquainted with the desert's treacherous nature, had learned to respect it not as an enemy, but as an ally in their struggle. They had come to understand that in this land of endless sand and scorching sun, survival depended not just on firepower, but on cunning, patience, and the ability to blend into the terrain. The Germans, with their heavy machines, had underestimated the power of the desert, but the Allies knew it well. It was here, in the vast emptiness, that they could turn the tables. The Allied forces were fewer in number, their vehicles lighter, more nimble. They had learned long ago that in a place where everything could be swallowed by the sand, speed and adaptability were just as important as strength. Their tactics were built around this principle. They would never face the Germans head-on. Instead, they relied on ambushes, guerrilla-style warfare, and the terrain itself to turn the desert into a weapon. The desert had a way of transforming the battlefield. Its vastness meant there were no predictable lines or boundaries, no clear front or rear. The Allies used this to their advantage, setting up in concealed positions where the German tanks couldn't see them. Their movement was calculated, precise, never hurried, never reckless. They would slip in and out of the sand dunes like shadows, striking when the Germans were most vulnerable. The tanks, so reliant on their size and power, were like predators in the open, while the Allies were like quick-footed scavengers, darting in, leaving confusion and chaos in their wake. From behind the cover of the dunes, the Allies observed the German column as it crawled forward, unaware of the trap being set for them. The air was dry, thick with heat. But the Allied soldiers moved with a cold focus, their eyes locked on the enemy. They knew the sand could be just as deadly for them as it was for the Germans. The key was to use it, use the wind, use the dust, use the silence. The Allied forces waited, watched, and listened. Every movement of the German column was noted in careful detail. Every shift in position logged in the mind, like a map being drawn from instinct. One Allied commander, who had fought in the desert for months, looked out over the battlefield and muttered to his men, "The Germans may have the firepower, but we have the land." It wasn't bravado, but a quiet confidence born from experience. He knew that while the Germans relied on their tanks and their firepower, the Allies had something much harder to come by: a deep understanding of how to use the desert against its invaders. The sand was no longer just a challenge, it was an opportunity. It was a place where the smallest mistakes could be deadly, where speed and surprise were more powerful than sheer force. The Allied forces weren't just fighting the Germans. They were fighting the environment as well, using it to their advantage, while the Germans struggled against it. Every ambush, every delay, every diversion was a testament to the Allies' ability to adapt, to turn the desert into a battlefield of their own making. The German tanks, unable to keep up with the shifting sands and the quick, elusive tactics of the Allies, were beginning to show signs of wear. The desert was doing its work, but it was the Allies who were making it count. And in the end, it wouldn't be the tanks that decided the battle. It would be the men who understood the land, who knew how to use it against the enemy. The silence of the desert was shattered as the German tanks continued their march, their engines growling beneath the oppressive sun. Yet the desert, with all its vastness, wasn't giving up its ground easily. The air, heavy with heat, seemed to press against the tanks as they struggled to move forward, one sluggish revolution of their treads at a time. For all their imposing size, the tanks were trapped in a world that didn't care how powerful they were. The sand beneath their tracks shifted, clogging up the treads, turning what was meant to be a smooth advance into a slow, grinding crawl. The first sign of trouble came when the engine of the lead Tiger tank coughed. It was a guttural sound. Unnatural, something had gone wrong. The commander inside cursed under his breath. They had been on the move for hours, and the heat was beginning to take its toll. The heavy armor, once seen as a fortress, now acted like an oven, trapping heat and suffocating the crew inside. Sweat poured down the faces of the soldiers, but there was no escape from it. They had no choice but to push forward, to ignore the overheating engines, the scorching metal beneath their feet, and the relentless heat pressing down on them from all sides. Behind the Tiger, the Panzer IVs were no better off. The second tank lurched forward, its engine sputtering, struggling to keep up with the lead tank. It was too heavy for the terrain. The soft sand sucked at its wheels, and with every movement, it seemed to sink deeper into the earth. The driver worked furiously, twisting the controls, trying to free the tank from the grip of the sand. But it was futile. The massive vehicle refused to move, its engine roaring in protest. A voice crackled over the radio, sharp with frustration. "Move forward, damn it! Keep the column moving!" But the tank wouldn't budge. A thin plume of smoke started to curl up from the engine vents, signaling the inevitable a breakdown. At the rear of the column, the half-tracks carrying infantry soldiers were struggling just as much. The soldiers, once eager to engage, now looked out over the vast expanse of the desert, their faces drawn in exhaustion. They could see the tanks ahead, stalling, sinking into the sand. The fuel trucks, too, lagged behind, their engines overheated from the strain of keeping up with the tanks. The once proud German assault had become a bottleneck, a crawling line of immobile machines, each one trying to push through a desert that had no mercy. The desert, indifferent to the size and might of the German war machine, had already begun to tear apart their carefully orchestrated advance. The sand chewed at their vehicles, and the heat gnawed at their resolve. The tanks, those symbols of strength, were slowly being rendered powerless by the very terrain they had underestimated. The soldiers inside, once confident in their superiority, now felt the sinking dread of a battle they could not win with strength alone. They could hear the grinding of the engines, the hiss of steam, and the unnatural silence that followed each failed attempt to advance. In this battle, the tanks were not the predators, they were the prey, and the desert was the hunter. In the midst of it all, the only sound that broke the monotony of failure was the occasional shout from a German officer, trying to rally the men, trying to keep the tanks moving, but the growing sense of helplessness was palpable. The desert was not an enemy that could be beaten with firepower or brute strength. It was a force that had to be respected, understood. The German column, so sure of its might just hours before, was now at the mercy of the sand. The battle had shifted in an unexpected way, and the Germans were quickly realizing that this was no longer a war of tanks versus infantry. This was a war of man versus the land itself. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows over the desert as the German column crawled forward, trapped by the shifting sands. Ray Thompson, perched within the cold metal shell of the M10 Wolverine, watched it all unfold through his fogged periscope, his breath shallow and his mind sharp. The German tanks, once mighty and unstoppable, were now vulnerable, their engines sputtering, their massive frames sinking deeper into the sand with every passing minute. The desert had already claimed its first victims. The German column had become a slow-moving target, a perfect opportunity. But Ray had been given no orders, no permission to engage. His job was to observe, report, and wait. But this moment was different. As the German tanks struggled to advance, Ray could see the road ahead, the vital crossroad at Noville, a place that could change the course of the war if it fell into enemy hands. The German forces were moving directly toward it, their tanks stacked tightly together, a perfect formation, one designed for strength and support. But it was also a formation that made them vulnerable. The desert, with its endless stretches of sand and harsh terrain, had already begun to break the German resolve. The tanks were overheating. Their movement had slowed to a crawl. They were stalled, waiting for the right moment to push forward. And in that moment, Ray knew the time for waiting was over. His fingers tightened around the controls, his gloved hands steady despite the cold. He had been trained to observe, to follow orders. But the reality of the situation made it clear. If he waited for clearance, it would be too late. The German tanks were nearly at the crossroads, and if they reached it, it would cut off vital supplies to the 101st Airborne Division, already encircled in Bastogne. It would be a disaster. But if he could take them out, if he could dismantle the column with precision and timing, he could stop the Germans in their tracks. He scanned the tanks again. The Tiger I at the front was formidable, but the Panzer IVs behind it were tightly packed, vulnerable to a well-placed shot. The half-tracks carrying infantry were just behind the tanks, and the support vehicles, fuel trucks, ammo carriers were in the rear. He could take them out, one by one, and cause chaos in the ranks. He could create a bottleneck, isolate the tanks, and disable their retreat. Ray's mind was calculating. Each second ticking by with the weight of 1,000 decisions. He knew the risks. One wrong move, one miscalculation, and he could expose his position, endangering not just his crew, but the entire operation. But he also knew the cost of doing nothing. He had spent months studying German tactics, understanding how their columns moved, how their tanks relied on tight formations for support. He knew exactly where to hit. And now, the moment had come. Without hesitation, Ray adjusted the angle of the gun, his finger resting lightly on the trigger. He wasn't waiting for orders anymore. He was making a decision, one that could change everything. With a deep breath, he pulled the trigger. The sound of the gunshot echoed in the vast emptiness of the desert, a sharp crack that cut through the silence. The battle had begun not with a command, but with a single, decisive action. And in that moment, Ray Thompson knew that the rules of engagement had just been rewritten. The first shot rang out, shattering the stillness of the desert. The sound of Ray Thompson's M10 Wolverine firing its powerful cannon seemed to echo across the barren landscape, but it was quickly swallowed by the vast emptiness. The impact was instantaneous. The 3rd Panzer IV, neatly positioned in the middle of the German column, erupted in a violent burst of flame. The explosion sent a shockwave rippling through the air, scattering debris in all directions. The sound was deafening, metal screaming, the fireball blossoming into the sky, and the very earth shaking beneath the force of the blast. For a moment, the German column seemed to freeze in place. The tanks at the front, the Tiger I and its companions, lurched to a halt, their crew members unsure of what had just happened. The Panzer IV was burning now, its turrets spinning wildly, the fire consuming the machine from the inside out. Smoke rose in thick clouds, and the once ordered column of German tanks was now a disordered, chaotic mess. The tight formations they had relied on for protection had been shattered in a split second. Ray didn't wait to see the full extent of the destruction. His gunner's instincts kicked in as his crew began to reload. His mind was already calculating the next target, even as the smoke from the first explosion began to obscure his view. The Germans were disoriented, their neatly arranged convoy now a cluster of confused vehicles, all scrambling to react. The confusion was palpable. They hadn't expected an attack, certainly not from a single American tank destroyer. Alone in the desert, Ray knew this was his moment, the one that would define the battle. As the loader rammed the next shell into the chamber, Ray shifted his aim slightly to the left, moving just 5 yards to avoid detection. The German gunners, still trying to find the source of the attack, were focused on the previous muzzle flash. In this moment, Ray was a ghost, moving silently, taking advantage of the desert's disorienting effects. He didn't just shoot, he positioned himself like a sniper, using the terrain to remain hidden, to outmaneuver his enemies without ever revealing too much. The second shot rang out, this time hitting a half-track carrying infantry. The explosion was almost as spectacular as the first, sending bodies flying and fuel igniting in an inferno. The fire spread rapidly, cascading through the dry underbrush and lighting the forest floor in patches of orange and black. The confusion in the German ranks intensified. Soldiers scrambled, their guns firing wildly into the trees, unsure of where the attack was coming from. Their sense of order had completely broken down. Ray Thompson's mind remained cool, precise. He reloaded again, scanning the enemy forces. They were trapped, their tight formation now a liability. They had no room to maneuver, no escape routes. The roar of battle filled the air, but Ray was focused on one thing: destruction. His third shot tore into a fuel truck near the rear of the column. The blast was cataclysmic. Flames shot skyward like a volcanic eruption, illuminating the battlefield and casting long, eerie shadows across the wreckage. 2 nearby infantrymen were knocked to the ground, dazed by the blast. But Ray's focus never wavered. Each shot was calculated, surgical. As the column ground to a halt, the Germans were no longer just stunned, they were panicking. The Tiger at the front tried to reverse, its massive engine roaring in an attempt to clear a path, but the column was too tightly packed. There was nowhere to go. The half-tracks and support vehicles, which had once been crucial to their logistics, were now traps, blocking any chance of retreat. Chaos reigned, and all of it was unfolding in front of one American tank destroyer. Ray Thompson's shots had ripped apart the heart of the German advance. The column, once a symbol of German strength, was now immobilized and burning, What had been an unstoppable force only minutes before was now a flailing, disjointed group of vehicles fighting to survive. And in the middle of it all, Ray Thompson, with a steady hand and a sharp mind, had turned the tide of the battle. The desert, once quiet and unmoving, was now alive with the sounds of destruction. The wind had picked up, swirling through the trees, carrying with it the thick smell of smoke and burning metal. The battlefield, which had been just a patch of empty land only hours before, was now a sea of wreckage, twisted steel, and shattered armor, half sunk into the sand like the remains of a forgotten war. The German tanks, once symbols of unstoppable power, lay scattered across the desert floor, their metal husks smoking and broken, consumed by the very terrain they had underestimated. Ray Thompson, his heart still pounding in his chest, lowered his periscope and surveyed the aftermath. His M10 Wolverine tank, now eerily quiet, stood as the lone sentinel in the middle of the battlefield. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the wreckage, painting the scene with a haunting glow. The fires from the destroyed tanks crackled in the distance, sending plumes of smoke into the fading sky. The desert, which had been so harsh and unyielding just hours before, now seemed to offer a fleeting, eerie calm, as if it too were taking a breath after the storm had passed. The German column, once a proud and disciplined force, was now reduced to a broken mess of burning vehicles and scattered infantry. The Tiger tank, which had led the charge with its heavy armor and formidable firepower, lay immobilized, its turret blown off, its crew either dead or fled. The Panzer IVs were no better off. Their tracks had been torn apart, their engines silenced, and their once pristine armor now twisted and deformed by the explosions that had torn through them. The half-tracks, meant to carry infantry into battle, were now little more than flaming wrecks, their crews either burned alive or scattered into the desert. Unsure of where to run, as the smoke began to clear, the full extent of the destruction became visible. The road, which had been so crucial to the Germans' advance, was now a narrow path clogged with burning metal and the charred remains of once proud war machines. The sand, once a silent observer of the conflict, had now claimed its prize. The German forces, though once so confident, had been reduced to nothing more than remnants of a failed strategy, their mission abandoned in the face of the Allies' unexpected counterattack. The Allied soldiers, who had been hiding in the dunes and watching from their concealed positions, began to move in cautiously. They approached the wreckage, their faces grim but their eyes wide with a mix of disbelief and awe. They had anticipated a hard-fought battle, but they had never expected to see the German advance come to such a brutal halt. What had once been a column of tanks, infantry, and support vehicles now lay in ruins, a testament to the power of the desert and the precision of the man who had struck when it mattered most. Ray Thompson's crew slowly emerged from the M10, their bodies stiff and exhausted from the long hours of tension. But there was no celebration, no cheers. They had done their job, but the reality of what they had accomplished set in slowly, like the chill that crept through the desert night. The wreckage told the story of an enemy halted, of lives lost, and of a battle that had shifted, not because of firepower or numbers, but because one man had made a decision to act. The sun was nearly gone, replaced by the cool, dark emptiness of the desert night. As Ray looked out over the battlefield, he saw nothing but the shattered remains of a German column. The silence, once again, was deafening. The war wasn't over, but this moment, this day, had been won. The ghosts of the battlefield, the twisted remains of metal, the burning wrecks, and the scattered bodies would fade into the desert, swallowed by the sand. And yet, Ray Thompson knew this moment would never truly disappear. The desert had claimed its prize, and in doing so, it had turned the tide of a forgotten battle. As the first rays of dawn broke over the desert, casting pale light on the smoldering wreckage of the German column, Ray Thompson sat quietly inside his M10 Wolverine. The silence had returned, almost suffocating in its stillness. The fires from the destroyed tanks had died down, leaving only the faint smoke curling up into the cool morning air. The landscape, which had witnessed a brutal clash of wills the day before, now seemed almost serene, the devastation now blending into the vast, unyielding desert as if it had never happened. The wreckage, twisted and deformed, stood as a grim monument to the power of the terrain and the decisiveness of one man's actions. Thompson and his crew were exhausted, their bodies stiff from hours of tension and the heavy physical labor of fighting in such a harsh environment. But as the adrenaline of battle drained away, a strange, unsettling calm began to settle in. They had done their job. They had stopped the German advance, saved the crucial supply lines to the 101st Airborne, and ensured that Noville, a vital crossroads, remained in Allied hands. And yet, despite the magnitude of their success, there was no celebration. The sense of relief was muted, buried beneath the knowledge that they had defied orders, that they had acted without permission. The official military records would not tell the full story. The German losses would be noted, but the true nature of the battle would fade into the background, overshadowed by larger, more publicized campaigns. The battle in the desert would be remembered only by those who had fought it. And even then, it would be a footnote in the grand history of World War II. The real victory, the one that made the difference, wasn't one of overwhelming firepower or strategic brilliance. It had been a moment of gut instinct, a moment when Ray Thompson had chosen to act, and in doing so, had rewritten the rules of engagement. A few days later, scouts from the 101st Airborne arrived to assess the battlefield. They were tired, their faces hollow from days of combat and deprivation, but when they saw the wreckage of the German column, their expressions turned to disbelief. They had expected to find a road crawling with tanks, infantry, and support vehicles. Instead, they found a desolate path of burning wrecks and shattered steel. The sight was a triumph, but it didn't match the stories the scouts had heard. They had been told it was an ambush, that a full battery of American tanks had launched an attack. But there was no battery. There was only one tank destroyer. And the man inside it had decided, in that moment, to change the course of the battle. Word spread quickly through the Allied ranks. Tales of the lone gunner who had stopped an entire German column with nothing but precision and a willingness to act in the absence of orders became legend. Some exaggerated the story, claiming Ray had destroyed 10 tanks with 5 shots, or that he had used trick shots like a pool player to destroy the enemy. But the truth, as it always does, lay somewhere in the middle. Ray Thompson had acted when no one else would, and that single act had turned the tide. Back at battalion headquarters, the official investigation began. Ray Thompson's field notes were reviewed, his crew was interviewed, and attempts were made to corroborate the story with higher command. The lines had been jammed. There were no clear orders, no direct communication from the top. What could be confirmed was the outcome. 7 vehicles destroyed, 4 more immobilized, no Allied casualties, and the strategic objective Noville was held. It was a flawless mission, executed with a level of precision that few commanders would have dared to attempt. And yet, despite the success, the military command was cautious. Ray Thompson's actions were unorthodox, breaking protocol in a way that could have led to disastrous consequences. He had defied orders, acted without clearance, and in doing so, had created a new doctrine. The division commander, after reviewing the case, decided not to reprimand Ray, but to quietly assign him the task of training other gunners on a new firing pattern theory. It was a decision that would shape future combat training and tactics, though it would remain largely unspoken and uncelebrated. The Army had not just forgiven him, they had learned from him. Years later, after the war had ended, Ray Thompson returned to his home in Kansas. He never sought recognition, never boasted of his actions in the desert. He opened a small repair shop, fixing tractors and building silos, living a quiet life. But even in the quiet corners of the world, legends grow. Ray was never called a hero, not in the traditional sense, at least. There were no medals, no parades, but those who had fought alongside him, those who had survived the war, spoke of him differently. To them, he was a hero. His legacy, though understated, would live on in the annals of military doctrine as the man who had redefined the art of combat in the desert. Years later, a historian would find the original field report tucked away in a box of forgotten after-action reports. The account of Ray's actions would be studied, not as an example of disobedience, but as a case study in flexibility, in understanding when to break the rules for the greater good. The story of the Ghost Battery would not be recorded in official history books, but its lessons would shape the future of warfare. And perhaps that was Ray's greatest victory, not the battle itself, but the quiet way in which his decision had changed the course of military tactics, not through brute force, but through precision, timing, and a willingness to act when the rules fell silent.